Pay close attention. The news you're about to see is fulfilling Bible prophecy.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, in the news this week, Katan, we're going to talk about the Kerch Strait. We know that is a key shipping route, and this week Russia and Ukraine got into quite a bit of a squabble there. Also, the U.S. military, despite their billions of dollars over any of the next competitors, now the analysts are saying that if they were to get into a war, they would likely lose. So those details, and also we're going to talk about the Turk stream, which is the pipeline that we've mentioned before that runs between Turkey and Russia. That is just about complete and getting ready to open. But first we're going to talk about some of the drug problems, namely marijuana and the opioids. In 2017, it was a very busy year for emergency response teams, many receiving calls to tend to drug overdose victims every day. Now, the CDC reported 70,237 deaths due to overdose in 2017. Now, that's a 10% increase from the year before. Death by suicide is also at its highest rate ever in the last 50 years. And if you live in rural areas, the likelihood of suicide is twice that of urban communities. Now, as a result of these deaths, the average life expectancy in America has dropped for the second year in a row to 78.7 years.
Wow, that's sad. Well, today there is a lot going on to combat overdoses, such as more recovery services available and an increased supply of the overdose antidote Narcan. Medicaid now pays for the treatment of overdose victims, and there has been a crackdown on dealers selling the deadliest opioids as well. But even though some impact has been made, the war on drugs is still not being won.
While America recognizes there is a crisis where opioid use and overuse is concerned, the U.S. legislature is busy legalizing the sale of marijuana and not just for medicinal use. Now, take Vermont and Maine, for example. Both states have recently legalized the drug and are now working on regulations so it can be sold by licensed vendors. Now, in total, 10 states plus Washington, D.C. have legalized recreational marijuana, and an additional 23 states have legalized marijuana in its medicinal form.
Wow. In Massachusetts, recreational pot sales officially kicked off on November 20th. The store called Cultivate in Leicester, Massachusetts, received over 1,000 customers in the first day alone. Not only is the pot flavored with things like chocolate, it's also a lot stronger than what people used to smoke behind authorities' backs.
There were long lines and high excitement outside the first two stores, some waiting as long as 5 hours to be part of the historic opening of the recreational pot shops. Now, one 64-year-old man explained to journalists that he remembered when he used to run from police when he bought marijuana, so now that it was legal, he wanted to do it just for that reason.
Wow. Well, upon entering Cultivate, customers are presented with a menu showing the daily selections to choose from, such as Tropicana cookies, Purple Punch, and the bestseller Chocolate OG. While it may be legal, it definitely isn't cheap. To purchase 1 ounce of the raw bud will cost you $420 just for an ounce. But the price didn't stop people from coming to Cultivate. One woman said she was going to take it home and enjoy it with her grandmother. Wow.
Well, Sam Barber, president and co-owner of Cultivate, told CBS this morning, "It's like your coffee in the morning." He continued, "There's a lot of wrong information going out there about this product, and again, it is about doing it like anything. It is in a safe, balanced way that's healthy."
I'll stick with my coffee.
Yeah.
But Kevin Sabet former White House drug policy advisor, says people think this has actually gone through some kind of safety and efficacy that we know of or know what it is, he said, but it hasn't. Sabet is now president of Smart Approaches to Marijuana and says you're relying on the state that is being heavily influenced by the marijuana industry themselves to basically tell you that their product is safe.
Well, the reality couldn't be further from the truth. Sabet points out since Colorado made pot legal, they've had literally hundreds of thousands of problems. Now, there have been recalls because of additives and things like bacteria and mold found in marijuana products. So he says it's really buyer beware.
Despite the problems, sales are booming, they say, with a jump in the number of Americans using pot on a daily or almost daily basis. In 2002, pot use in America was around 3.1 million users daily. The figure rose to 8.1 million in 2017. But there's more going on here than meets the eye.
Well, Kevin, Sabet says this isn't about the individual user. This is about a green light to an industry that is taking all of their plays from big tobacco that lied to the American people for almost a century. Why would we get fooled again? Now, projected sales in Massachusetts are estimated to reach $1.5 billion, and even without federal legalization, Americans are already consuming 3 times the global average of cannabis.
And I know that Sabet was one of the people on the forefront to stand up against tobacco and the tobacco industry. So looks like he's doing the same thing here with marijuana and comparing the two about people falling for misinformation from the manufacturers and, of course, the sellers of those products. Well, in the late 1990s, the opioid crisis began, but by the year 2012, doctors were writing 259 million prescriptions each year. Now, this push by pharmaceutical companies and doctors to get unsuspecting Americans essentially taking opium has skyrocketed to astronomical proportions. 259 million prescriptions is enough to give every single American adult their very own bottle of opioids.
Well, even unsuspecting parents encourage their children to take these opioids with the belief that they were helping them. Then, when the opioids became less accessible, either by law or by policy, they were already hooked, so they switched to heroin. Now, this led to the statistic that we have today that 4 out of every 5 heroin users say they originally got hooked from prescription meds like Oxycontin. It started with the prescriptions and ended up with heroin.
Right. Well, shouldn't the pharmaceutical companies of these drugs have known this? Are the drug manufacturers who gave incentives to doctors to overprescribe the real culprits of the crisis? You know, many want to know that. And what about those doctors? Shouldn't they have known that oxycodone, a chemical cousin of heroin and the sole ingredient of OxyContin, which is twice as powerful as morphine, would be addictive?
Well, even the former commissioner of the FDA is quoted as saying that there are very few drugs more dangerous than opioids. Now, despite that warning, however, Purdue Pharmaceuticals, the maker of OxyContin, along with other companies, launch marketing campaigns to get people not to believe that information.
And it's interesting because where those things come from, which is the poppy plant, there's a huge industry in places like Afghanistan where those poppy plants, the huge poppy fields are grown, and it's almost like what you kind of find with cocaine and marijuana, those areas that are heavily guarded, because they are going to take constituents from those things to make drugs to sell to people. And so they don't want to see that money dwindle, neither do the doctors or the pharmaceutical industry. So sad to say, but doctors were paid to incentivize or convince millions of Americans that opioid addictions were overblown and exaggerated and that OxyContin could be used on all types of problems. So what does that tell us? Jeff, many people want to know, what does that tell us? What do we know? That in fact, over the years, and based on the research, that those doctors and manufacturers were absolutely wrong.
Right, which of course was too late now for all the thousands of Americans that died from the drug overdoses that we've had just recently that we've been reporting upon. So, you know, just like we talked about the tobacco, how they started off and then they found that was harmful, and then now the same thing with marijuana, and of course we see it with the opioids.
Yeah, so we've got another generation of people here that are hooked on something that initially started from a prescription from a doctor, now is blown out of control. People are dying as a result of this, and basically this whole system's going down the tube as a result.
And what about Purdue Pharmaceuticals, the maker of OxyContin? Well, sales from OxyContin are said to have generated more than $35 billion in revenue. So you see what the driving force is there.
Yeah, that's right. Recently, I know that the members of the G20 met down in Argentina. Our field correspondent Larry McGee is going to be discussing some of what took place down there. But Larry, I understand that a deal between Russia and Turkey is pretty much, we kind of see that coming to an end. Not the deal, but the fruition of the works that they had in plan regarding a gas line, pipeline that's being made from Russia to Turkey to supply them natural gas. What exactly is taking place in regards to that pipeline?
Well, economic cooperation between Moscow and Ankara is continuing to strengthen, with the last section of the Turk Stream gas pipeline recently being welded. The gas pipeline spans across the Black Sea into Turkey, and when it is fully operational, it is expected to transport 31 billion cubic meters of gas into Turkey and Europe. The project is reported to have carried a price tag of $7 billion. In a joint announcement by the country's two leaders, President Putin stated that the launch of Turk Stream will allow the two nations to substantially expand their cooperation. He offered as well that it will have great significance for the economic development of Turkey and the entire Black Sea region, and will also become an important factor that will guarantee security for energy throughout Europe. The pipeline is said to have been designed with the specific intent to bypass the contentious territory of the Ukraine as a transit route to Europe. President Erdogan says the conduit will benefit Turkey in addition to its neighbors. Along with the pipeline, Moscow and Ankara are also reported to be cooperating on a $20 billion project to construct a nuclear power plant and a $2.5 billion weapons deal for an S-400 missile system. The win for win between the two countries is that Turkey is looking for more energy suppliers and Russia is looking for more energy markets. Their increased economic and military cooperation is also leading to greater cooperation on other matters such as Syria as well. All is not well when vows are broken, and as the current U.S. administration threatens to withdraw from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty signed in 1987, Russia is countering by proposing new legislation within its parliament to change the rules concerning their use of nuclear weapons. A month earlier, President Trump announced that he had decided to exit the bilateral agreement. President Putin has responded by saying that if he in fact does, then that move will be met with concrete steps from Russia. Two of America's strongest European allies are taking a step back from the current president and giving lectures on government. Chancellor Merkel of Germany and President Macron of France believe President Trump needs to learn the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. In an address, Chancellor Merkel stated that there are people who say they can solve everything themselves and don't have to think about anyone else. That is nationalism in its purest form, she said. That is not patriotism. President Macron has made similar statements, but where President Trump is concerned, the U.S. position is simple: America first. The source of contention between the three nations is thought to stem from the fact that America has drawn a line in the sand, and the various nations of the world are being compelled to either side with the U.S. or China and Russia. Neither France nor Germany have complied, and Berlin has even gone so far as to hash out its own energy deals with Moscow. That prompted a warning from the president direct from the UN floor, threatening to isolate the nation if they didn't change course. Where France is concerned, President Trump is displeased with the idea being promoted by the French leader for Europe to develop an army to protect itself from the U.S. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Katana, looks like it's going to be hard for the G20 to accomplish anything in the global economy with that amount of disunity.
That's right. Sad.
Well, does it seem like the gap between rich and poor is getting larger? It's not just a figment of your imagination. It's a startling continuous pattern, and you'll be surprised to see just how large the gap has grown over the years. Well, this next video will give you some insight into income inequality on an international scale. Take a look.
Some people are rich and some people are poor, and it can seem pretty impossible to fix. Let's look at both types of inequality at the global level. Global wealth today is estimated at about $260 trillion and is not distributed equally. One study shows that North America and Europe, while they have less than 20% of the world's population, have 67% of the world's wealth. China, which has more people than North America and Europe combined, has only about 8% of the wealth. India and Africa together make up almost 30% of the population, but only share about 2% of the world's wealth. We're teaching economics, so we can focus on income inequality. These 10 people represent everyone on the planet, and they're lined up according to income. Poorest over here and richest over here. This group represents the poorest 20%. This is the second poorest 20%, the middle 20%, and so on. If we distributed $100 based on current income trends, this group would get about 83 of those dollars. The next richest group would get $10, the middle gets $4, the second poorest group would get $2, and the poorest 20% of humans would get $1. Branko Milanovic, an economist that specializes in inequality, explained all this by describing an economic Big Bang. At first, countries' incomes were all bunched together, but with the Industrial Revolution, the differences exploded. It pushed some countries forward onto the path to higher incomes, while others stayed where they had been for millennia. According to Milanovic, in 1820, the richest countries in the world, Great Britain and the Netherlands, were only 3 times richer than the poorest, like India and China. Today, the gap between the richest and poorest nations is like 100 to 1. The gaps are getting bigger and bigger.
Oh, looks like that gap has really stretched out there over the years.
Yeah, and it's really sad because with the amount of resources that we have globally, there really is an excuse that there should be such a large gap and that we have so many people that are in poverty. Sad. Well, Russia and Ukraine are involved in a naval standoff in the Kerch Strait. Russia is sending more S-400 missiles to the area as a deterrent to what President Putin says is a provocation by the Ukrainian president. President Putin said of the Ukrainian president that he was behind the provocation and that regarding the next elections, his popularity rating stands at around 5th in line. So he might not even make it to the second round, and something needs to be done.
Well, Ukraine has declared martial law in 10 of its 27 regions. President Poroshenko says that he wants to stave off a Russian invasion. Now, this all started after Russia's seizure of 3 Ukrainian vessels and their crews after what Russia says was the ship's illegal entry into Russian waters. Now, Ukraine denies that claim, but a Crimean judge has ordered 12 of the 24 sailors to remain in detention for 2 months before trial. Now, Russia also released footage of Ukrainian soldiers confessing.
Interesting. The Ukraine-Russia relations started to collapse in November 2013. After then, President Yanukovych rejected a trade deal offered by the EU and instead took a $15 billion bailout from Moscow. The result? Months of street protests, which eventually led to the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in February of 2014. Well, later, the Crimean parliament was seized and Russian flags were raised. Russia, of course, has ignored requests from the international community regarding the Crimean annexation. And, of course, over 10,000 people have died in subsequent fighting between Russia and pro-government fighters in eastern Ukraine.
Well, so far, peace deals have not produced the intended results, and both parties, Russia and Ukraine, are standing their grounds on their views, not willing to back down. So tensions in the area are looking to get worse before they get any better.
Yeah. Well, in the meantime, Poroshenko is calling on the international community to help him secure his country. Poroshenko said in an interview with the very popular Bild German newspaper, "We cannot accept this aggressive policy of Russia. First, it was Crimea, then it was eastern Ukraine. What will Putin do next if we don't stop him?" He also said Germany is one of our closest allies, and we hope that states within NATO are now ready to relocate naval ships to the Sea of Azov in order to assist Ukraine and provide security.
Well, Germany hasn't had a clear response as of yet, but they have called for de-escalation of the conflict. Although Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, Poroshenko said that he does have the support of NATO and President Trump. If they were a member of NATO, they'd be able to trigger Article 4 and have an instant reaction to get naval ships deployed quickly. Well, so far, there's been a lot of talk regarding the matter from NATO, the NATO hierarchy, but no action as of yet.
A bipartisan commission selected by Congress has released a report finding that the U.S. has lost its military edge and could lose a war against China-Russia. Michael Morrell, a former deputy director of the CIA and current national security contributor to CBS News, was a part of that very commission. He spoke to CBS News concerning the findings and said, abroad, our main competitors, China and Russia, have been for some time preparing for fighting conventional wars, while we've been involved for the last 17 years in non-conventional wars such as counterterrorism. So he says we have not kept up.
Well, at home, he said the issue, a Budget Control Act of 2011 sequestration, which significantly cut military spending. Now, that combination has brought the U.S. to this place. The U.S. still spends $716 billion a year compared to China's $175 billion and Russia's $60 billion on military spending. So why isn't the U.S. better equipped? Well, Morrell said that our competitors have a much smaller area to worry about. They worry about the regions in which they live, Russia, China, Korea, Iran, and so forth, while the U.S., on the other hand, has to worry about the entire globe because our interests, he said, are diverse. Yep.
Well, the scenario in which the U.S. would have a hard time in winning a war is if China launched a surprise attack on Taiwan. He said the U.S. would have a hard time getting forces to the area because the Chinese have invested in aerial denial weapons that are specifically designed to keep us pretty much at bay. So the U.S. could mount a counterattack if they mobilize the nation, and we might be able to actually win the war. But he said even if we did, it would come at an enormous cost to the efforts.
Well, when Morrell was asked if he was optimistic that this would get fixed, he simply said no. There were similar warnings in 2010 and 2014 by other panels, and nothing has been done. And in order to actually fix this, we would need a political consensus. Now, he concluded by saying that this reminded him of all of the strategic warnings before 9/11, and we know how that ended.
I think part of the problem that we're seeing there is, A, we don't have unity within our own government, not to mention unity amongst the international governments, and everybody's mindset is on, strategic fighting wars, a way to get the upper hand over their, what they consider enemy, and we're really not coming together. The nations aren't coming together to look for peace, and so as a result, we're pretty much on the verge of war, not to mention the fact that our quote-unquote war on drugs is not working. So we've got problems at home and we've got problems abroad. And so until the United States and the other countries actually start to sit down at the same table and put together a practical solution of peace, we are pretty much headed, as many of the analysts have said, to World War III. And they said it's not going to be conventional, it's going to be nuclear.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, if you'd like to learn more about these stories, please contact the House of Yahweh. And when you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the Prophetic Word magazine and monthly newsletter. Here's how. To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas, 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites, Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, or Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can also visit our website by going to YPNnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can do so by emailing info@yahweh.com. Any international calls, you can call the number that's on your screen now. And once again, if you haven't taken the step to go to yisraelsays.com or askyisrael.com to check out 2 absolutely wonderful and free Bible study tools that are on the market, please do so. You'll be glad you did. Search any scriptural topic and find pages and pages of information guaranteed to answer all your scriptural questions.
Well, Jeff, I've heard it said in times past, if you want to be successful, follow what successful people are doing. Yisrael Hawkins has been successful in bringing peace in his life and the communities, so I would suggest that those who desire peace follow what he's teaching. Don't go anywhere. Up next, Yisrael Hawkins in the House of Yahweh. We'd like to thank you for watching us here at YPN News. I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for joining.